Now, a much-awaited roundtable on a major societal challenge: how to strengthen democracy in the age of social media, misinformation, and radicalization. We have four amazing speakers joining us. Michael Natin, who is the director of the French Government Information Service, or SIG, for those of you in France. Sander van der Linden, who's a professor of social psychology in society at the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge in the UK, where I'm based, and the recent author of the book Foolproof: Why Misinformation Infects Our Minds and How to Build Immunity. And Vincent Pons, who is a professor at Harvard Business School, where his research examines the foundations of democracy. In 2023, Vincent received the Best Young French Economist Award. And lastly, Daniel Stone, who's associate professor of economics at Bowdoin College and author of Undue Hate, a behavioral economic analysis of hostile polarization in US politics and beyond. As an American voter, something I take quite seriously. So, we'll welcome them.
Okay, this roundtable will be moderated by my friend Adélaïde Zulfikar-Pasic, who is the co-director of BVA HAC23 and also the author of a French book that I highly recommend, Les Français sur le fil de l'engagement, and one of the best opinion and political experts in France. At the end of this 45-minute conversation, you will have the opportunity to ask questions to our four panelists. So, welcome, Michael. Welcome,
Just you two. Okay.
Adélaïde, and welcome, guys, from Boston and from Cambridge.
Is the microphone working? Yes, okay. Hello everyone, I'm delighted and honored to welcome our four speakers today. Thank you for accepting the invitation. I don't know how I have to watch the other speakers. Thank you for accepting the invitation to this discussion. So, how to strengthen democracy in the age of social media, misinformation and radicalization. Wow, what a challenge. It's an ambitious question and we have 1 hour to save democracy. And in the opening keynote this morning, I don't know if some of you listened to Dana Ayali, who is working on a book for the end of the year on this subject. Well, he doesn't call it misinformation. He mentioned corrosive information. He seemed to me quite pessimistic. But I'm sure that with the four of you, we'll come up to some solution at the end of this session. I will divide the discussion in two parts. First, we'll be starting by taking stock of the situation and see how, in your opinion, social media and misinformation are helping to polarize our political systems, and sometimes to the point of undermining our democracies. And then we'll skip to a more optimistic part of the discussion, and we'll see how we can improve the situation. You are four. The subject is fascinating, and so are you. So I will ask you to be, well, not too long in your answers. Let's jump straight in, if you agree. And I would like to start with you, Michael, because you represent today the practitioner, whereas the other speakers are more from the academic world. You are the one who is confronted to the reality of what we are going to discuss. The one was to communicate on behalf of the French government, to communicate on the public policies implemented. And so it's interesting for us to have your point of view on the situation. And maybe you could start by explaining to the audience what the SIG, Service d'information du gouvernement in French, the French government communication service is and what it does.
Thank you for having me. I'm quite impressed, to be honest. First by the level of academic background of the other speakers, and indeed I am the let's say the practitioner of the team. Before joining the administration and working in the public sector, I've been working for almost 20 years in different kind of companies, large group, as working on the marketing and communication side, and more specifically on the transformation of those activities through the development and the evolution of digital. So joining the government side and the public sector side was really in the same mindset, meaning that we were looking for transforming this communication and reinventing and modernizing it, which is quite a challenge as well. So what is the Service d'information du gouvernement? So first, it's an administration. We are, we are under the authority of the direct authority of the Prime Minister, and we have four missions, four different missions. The first one is to try to analyze and more specifically understand the evolution of the public opinion and the way the media and the traditional and the social media are evolving in terms of essentially content and trends. The second one is really to develop, create, and disseminate content in order to explain the government action, to amplify, obviously, the different government communication through the different state service and the decentralized service in France and abroad, and finally, because behind governmental, there is a subject of coordination. We are doing our best to coordinate the different entities in charge of communication in the state area, which is quite a challenge because there is a large number of people that are doing communication in this area. So.
Yes, what is for you the how would you describe the context in which you are conducting those four missions for the governmental communication?
So the context is the same for us than for any other people that are trying to communicate in these days. The first one is that our audience is literally overflowed and overloaded by messages coming from everywhere, and those audiences are solicited. I would say there is an over solicitation of all those people, specifically because of the digital area. In parallel, the information, the volatility of the information is quite important, and we can see and we can. The continuous flow and let's say the obsolescence of this information is a key factor that we have to integrate in the way we are communicating. Then the last thing which is quite important for us is the fact that there is a very strong fragmentation between the perception of the action of the public actors and the opinion. So this is part of the day-to-day environment that we have to deal with, and Given to that situation, we have to reinvent and modernize the way we are doing things, and more specifically to be specifically oriented with what are the main expectation of the audience, really moving to this area. We are usually using that very strong, I think that's very strong sentence, which is expectation is the new currency. Expectation is the new currency for us. If we are able to understand the expectation of the audience, then we can manage the way we are dealing with them. So the solution.
We'll talk about the solution after, if you agree. I'd like to hear the three other guests who, through their academic and research perspective, will be able to maybe explain the reasons of the context. I would like to ask now Sander van der Linden, because when we were preparing this discussion, you also mentioned things that Michael Nathan just mentioned. He talked about fragmentation, about the fact that people are overwhelmed by information. So you also mentioned the increasing complexity of the system, and not just because of social media, but more generally because of the increasing fragmentation of the environment. But what interests me most here today is hearing what you have to say with your social psychology hat on about the psychological forces that contribute to this phenomena.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you get with fragmentation is that people tend to be surrounded by other like-minded people who share the same views, and so one of the things that we know from basic cognitive science is that the more often you hear a claim the more likely you are to think that it's true. And so we know that the brain tends to believe repeated claims more than non-repeated claims. And this is called illusory truth. And so illusory truth happens because the brain mistakes fluency or the familiarity with which that we attach to claims for having some kind of truth value. And we all know that 2 times 2 is 4 because we've rehearsed it a lot, we've heard it a lot, and so we process that very fast. We don't think about it. And that's really the same with a lot of misinformation, unfortunately. So the more often you repeat a lie, and it doesn't even have to be a lie, right? You could just be surrounded in an environment where people have different kinds of opinions and different kinds of beliefs, but the more you hear them, the more likely you are to think that they're true because you literally become faster at processing that information because it resonates with what you already know about the world. And so the brain is literally faster at processing that information and therefore attaches a higher truth value to it. And so this is called illusory truth. And sometimes that can lead to extremism and polarization because if every group is doing that in different corners of a network, right? Being more exposed to a certain point of view, becoming more likely to endorse that point of view, then you see that people are drifting further apart at a network level. But I'll let some of my colleagues talk about the issue of polarization. So I think illusory truth is one important mechanism, and we all know famous examples of politicians who love to use what we call the big lie rule, right? The more often you repeat a falsehood, the more likely people are to believe it. And interesting research also shows that people think it's less immoral to share falsehoods that have been repeated versus ones that have not been repeated. Because if you hear something, the first time you hear it, it sounds extreme, it sounds outrageous. But the more you're exposed to it and the more you hear it from other people and the more it's normalized, people start to think, oh, maybe it's not so immoral to share this type of information. So I think that's one mechanism that everyone is pretty much susceptible to. I mean, illusory truth affects up to 75% of people, including children. So it's a very basic sort of cognitive mechanism. But then I think there's also some other interesting psychological factors. So if we talk about conspiracy theories, for example, in particular as a form of misinformation, which are quite prevalent, right? We see conspiracy theory during the pandemic, but also outside of the pandemic, whether it's aliens, right, or the government is hiding aliens, or they're lizard politicians in parliament, or Bill Gates is behind the pandemic. There's tons of examples. There's actually deep psychological motivations that lead people to want to endorse these kinds of narratives beyond just being duped by the fact that they're often repeated and seem more likely to be true. And three of those motivational factors are first is called the sort of epistemic motive. So, people in an uncertain world, people want answers, right? And so we're all in a search for truth and knowledge. And so conspiracy theories actually fulfill an important psychological function, which sounds kind of funny, but they connect the dots for people, right? So they offer a quote unquote, knowledge-based narrative that seems to give people some unique or special knowledge about the world that kind of satisfies our need to find answers for things that might be perceived as random and how could it be that all these things are happening if there's no explanation that will satisfy people in a simple way, right? Often what you find in reality, of course, is that mistakes are often random. There's a lot of government bureaucrats who don't communicate, right? And sometimes they mess up. Government can be quite disorganized. But conspiracy theories always paint this sort of picture that there's these evil actors who have this grand plan and they're all working together behind the scene to dupe people in this very, very smooth operation. And so, it is a narrative that can sort of, quest people's thirst for a neat sort of knowledge about how the world works. Then there's the what we call the social motive, which I think is very much underestimated. I mean, sure, there's sort of these cognitive mechanisms that lead people to endorse these narratives, but also it's a deeply social endeavor. I mean, especially people who feel marginalized, who feel that their opinions are not being heard. People who tend to be slightly more political extreme, but on the outsides of the political system, they need a movement to identify with. I mean, they feel that they're not part of society, that they're not part of the mainstream. And so they're looking for a movement to connect with. And so conspiracy theories actually fulfill an important social function. They allow people to identify with a larger movement. I mean, QAnon started as a conspiracy theory, but really evolved into a deep social movement, right? Where it's a home for people. It's where they can connect with other like-minded
Sander,
others.
sorry to interrupt you, but can you just give us share with us the last factor you mentioned, the epistemological aspect, the social one, and in just 1 minute, the last one. I'm sorry to hurry you, but
yeah. No, it's fine. It's fine. I think people get that there's a social element to conspiracies, right? And the last one is existential. I mean, people worry about the future. They worry about the world. There's climate change. There's pandemics. There's a lot of anxiety. And so what conspiracy theories do is they give people a sense of control, a sense of agency. So they try to manage that level of fear and worry by telling people, oh, the pandemic's not real, climate change is a hoax. And so it's much easier to believe that these things are fake than to deal with the deep consequences, both for individuals and as a society. So they manage fear and anxiety. So those are some of the important psychological functions of this kind of misinformation.
So they answer to a kind of anxiety. It's an answer to uncertainty that people don't like. I would like to ask you now, Vincent Ponce, you also work on this subject, the subject specifically of polarization, where we are seeing more and more, both in the United States and also in France. Your research has highlighted 4 key elements to explain the situation. Can you tell a bit about this, please?
Yes, so as you mentioned, in the US where I am based for work and in France where I come from, as well as in other countries, we have observed a rise in polarization. So the first point I want to make is, what are we talking about exactly when we say that polarization is increasing? We're talking about multiple phenomena. One of them is polarization on public policies. If you look at the US, for instance, if you take a random Republican voter and a random Democratic voter, they are now increasingly in disagreement. There are very few common grounds, whether it's about taxation policy, whether it's about societal issues, whether it's about the environment, and whether climate change exists, whether it's caused by humans, and how to address it. But there's also a growing affective polarization. So again, if you take these two voters, I'm imagining, one on the Democratic side and one on the Republican side, and you ask them, how do you feel towards other voters of your party, and how do you feel towards other voters of the opposite party? And then you compute the gap between their thermometer feelings. What you find is that people continue feeling equally close and warm towards supporters of the same party as theirs, but they increasingly hate people on the other side. That's something that I find quite worrying in the democracy, where hopefully we should have the possibility for deliberation, debate, perhaps sometimes being persuaded by someone on the other side. One of the consequences of the polarization, both on public policies and affective polarization, is that there is now increasingly room for people to distrust the other side so much that they don't agree on the facts even anymore. So, the debate, there's not a debate just about or disagreement about how to address a particular situation. There is even disagreement on what the facts are. I mentioned climate change. In the US, there are also lots of people, for instance, on the Republican side, that still respond in surveys that I don't believe that Biden won the last presidential election. So that's quite worrying. And that's a phenomenon that has been described as epistemological fragmentation. So we live in different worlds where we have different beliefs about what the core facts are. The third point that I want to make is that there is really a vicious circle of polarization. Once polarization starts, it tends to fuel itself. And you can see this at the individual level and then from one generation to the next. At the individual level, if you're in a moment of affective polarization where you hate the other side, one of the consequences will be that you no longer want to meet people from the other side. It's very unlikely that you have friends who are of a different opinion than yours. And therefore, it's easier and easier for your position to radicalize due to some of the process that Sander was mentioning. You keep repeating, you keep hearing the same truths or the same views as the one that you believed before. And so you can develop a caricatural view of the positions of the other side, which makes you even less likely to want to meet them. So you can see how the vicious circle works. And then from the point of view of the transmission of preferences from the parents to their kids, what happens as a result of polarization is that increasingly people move to neighborhoods that resembles them, that where people have the same views as theirs. And as a result of that, their kids are mostly exposed to peers and parents of other kids that also share the same views. So it's very difficult for them to be exposed to a diversity of opinions. And I have done a lot of research showing that the neighborhood where you grow up exerts a lot of influence on your future political behavior, on your future paths and preferences. So to give a concrete example, the result of polarization is that if you're a Republican voter, increasingly most of your neighbors will be Republican. So most of the kids of your neighbors will be of Republican parents. And therefore your own kids will tend to be exposed to all to the same views over and over again. And of course, the same is true on the Democratic side. And the last point I want to make is that I think there's now, large agreement on the fact that in the US in particular, there's a growth in polarization. But of course, that begs the question, why? Why is it the case that today we observe this? And when we say today, we mean in the last 2 or 3 decades. Why today? Why not before? And I think when we try to understand some of the possible causes, it's useful to compare the trends in polarization, both for different age categories and then across different countries. So, as I mentioned before, we see an increase in polarization in the US, in France, but we don't see it in all countries. For instance, in Germany, it's rather a decline that has been observed, in Australia as well. So that's interesting. And that can help us a little bit identify some of the causes. For instance, one thing that is specific to the US and to some extent to France as well is the growing importance of cable news. That's this importance hasn't been growing so much in other countries. So that could be one candidate explanation. It's harder to attribute the rise in polarization to social media because social media obviously are also widely spread in Germany. And if you look at the growth in polarization in different groups, one thing that we observe is that one of the groups where you observe the most increase in polarization is the people above 65, who are also the people who are using social media the least. So that suggests that we cannot all blame it on social media, even though they probably have played a role in that trend. So some economists that have compared trends across countries pointed to A, the role of cable news, and B, the role of elite polarization that has been increasing a lot in the US, not so much in other countries such as Germany.
Okay, thank you, Vincent. That's interesting what you say about the role of social media. When I discussed with our last guest, who is Dan Stone, he mentioned also he said that there is an undeniable effect of social media and the internet on misinformation and radicalization. But he tells us, and I want to hear you, Dan, about this, because it's what you write in your book, Undue Hate. You tell us that that the social media, in fact, amplifies in the kind of snowball effect a phenomenon linked to mainly human psychology. So could you explain us your theory, please?
Sure. So I agree that social media is not the primary cause of the polarization we're observing now. And in my book, I talk about how disagreements in general, not just political disagreements, but disagreements of all types, tend to cause people to dislike each other more than we should, sort of rationally speaking. So certainly political disagreements, and that's where we get the affective polarization that Vincent was talking about. but non-political ones as well, cause us to essentially dislike other people excessively. So you might wonder, I think most of us think that our interpersonal feelings, our feelings of dislike, are not, they're just feelings, right? So they can't be right or wrong. They can't be rational or irrational. But I talk about how actually our feelings can be wrong because our feelings are based on our beliefs. Our feelings towards other people are based on our beliefs about who they are, right? Our beliefs about their character traits and the corresponding actions they take, right? So, for example, I might dislike you a lot if I think that you are someone who never gives money to charity. Okay, so I have this belief that you never give money to charity, and if that belief is simply wrong, you do sometimes give to charity, I dislike you more than I should, based on my own criteria for like and dislike, right? And now you might think, well, I'm wrong in my belief, but maybe I'm not irrationally wrong because maybe I have good reasons for thinking you never donate. But it's also possible that I'm wrong irrationally, that my belief that you never donate was an overreaction to some limited information I had. Maybe I saw you have the chance to donate just once and you didn't donate. And I overreacted. I assumed you never donate. That would be what I call irrational or biased or non-Bayesian dislike. And I argue that that's certainly happening in politics as well. So Democrats on both sides, there's a lot of evidence, both sides dislike the other side more than they should and the reasons for this are much more complicated than I think most people would expect. There's a wider range of biases at play here. So I could give a quick example of sort of how this happens in a non-political context if there's time. I'll let you cut me off if there isn't time. So think about
yes, you have
two
like
brothers.
2 minutes for the example.
2 minutes? Great.
Yes, please.
So suppose there are two brothers splitting a piece of cake. Okay, so it's a non-political context. The older brother gets to cut the cake in half, and the older brother and choose which half to take. And the older brother truly wants to cut it in half 50-50, but due to an unconscious bias to favor own interests related to what's called motivated reasoning or my side bias, the older brother sort of accidentally takes 51% for himself. And the younger brother sees that, and so he disagrees that it's a fair split. But the younger brother mistakenly assumes the older brother intentionally gave himself more than 50% of the pie. And the younger brother also, due to what's called false consensus bias, thinks the older brother knows this, that the older brother must know he really took more than 50%. So the younger brother mistakenly thinks the older brother is more selfish than he really is, dislikes the older brother more than he should. Then when the younger brother has a chance to cut the pie, he retaliates by intentionally taking more than 50%. The older brother observes this, thinks that was unfair, thinks that's a sign of the younger brother's selfishness. And you can see how these actions would build on each other, and the excessive mistaken dislike could easily spiral or grow over time due to overconfidence, motivated reasoning, false consensus, and there are even more biases at play. And just to quickly note how social media would contribute, then if you go to social media to see what's going on, people have a tendency to get the news that confirms the prior beliefs that they already hold, that tells them what they want to believe is true. So that would just enhance our confidence that we're right, the younger brother is wrong. We actually tried to split the cake fairly. The younger brother is completely wrong to accuse us of doing the opposite. Mm-hmm. And our false beliefs would just strengthen and grow even further due to this biased media.
Okay, so we saw with the three of you that there are many psychological and human factors amplified in when what you said, Dan, snowball effect by social media. The question is, what can we do now? How can we imagine and implement a solution to fight against these effects, even if we don't really have the power or the total power to control social media, as Danieli told this morning. Sander van der Linden, you told me when we were preparing this discussion that indeed it's difficult to debunk misinformation once it's here. So you've developed an approach which is based on prevention. Could you briefly tell us what it is about?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, debunking can sometimes be helpful, but it will still continue to influence us after we've been exposed to a falsehood. And this is something called the continued influence of misinformation. That even when your brain recognizes something is false, it continues to retrieve false details from memory when people ask about it. So it's very difficult to unring a bell. So for that reason, we try to develop a new approach, or in fact build on an old approach, but bring it into the 21st century. And this idea is called pre-bunking. So instead of debunking, you pre-bunk and you try to preemptively refute falsehoods before they have a chance to quote unquote, infect people. In my book Foolproof, I sort of talk about the history of this approach, but it's based on this idea of psychological inoculation, which follows the vaccine metaphor almost exactly. So just as vaccines expose people to a weakened or inactivated strain of a virus to try to trigger the production of antibodies to help confer resistance against future infection, it turns out you can do the same more or less with the human mind. So by pre-exposing people to a weakened dose of a future falsehood or the techniques that are used to mislead people online, and by refuting those in advance, people can build up mental or cognitive resistance to future misinformation. And just as the body needs a lot of examples of what potential pathogen invaders look like in order to mount an effective immune response, it's kind of similar with the mind. So your mind needs a lot of examples, a lot of microdoses of what deception looks like in order to mount an effective psychological response, which is to see through the tactics and neutralize it. And so really that's the idea behind psychological inoculation. So rather than giving people more facts or more education, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I mean, by all means, that's a good thing. But it's much more specific. It's actually giving people a weakened dose of the types of attacks that they might be facing in the future and refuting those in advance. So it kind of builds specific resistance to propaganda rather than the sort of broader education about facts, which may or may not help people in specific situations. If we have time, I can end with a specific example.
We don't really have time. I'm sorry, Sander.
Okay, I'll end it there.
Sorry, but well, a kind of vaccine against misinformation. Vincent Ponce, you also consider that it's very complicated to fight against misinformation, and especially by controlling social media, because we don't have the power to do it. And so you have a lot to say about other sources of information. Can you tell us? You mentioned two when we prepared the discussion.
Yeah, so I don't know if we don't have the power to control social media. I actually think that
well,
I'm not an expert on this, but I believe that governments could do something.
I was not mentioning my neighbor. I was mentioning you and I. But yes, maybe.
Yes, that's then you're very correct about that. But I would love to hear what your neighbor has to say on regulations. But one thing I will say is that, in my view, in-person discussions, so discussions that we have in person, like we have today, even better when we're physically in the same location, I see them as an essential ingredient of a well-functioning democracy. Democracy is not just about counting the importance of different sides, but also about debate, about deliberation, and this deliberation takes place between voters on doorsteps during campaigns, at the workplace. And so I have done research showing that even at the age of social media, these discussions in person continue to have extremely large effects on mobilizing voters, so deciding voters to come and vote instead of staying at home, and helping us decide which candidates to vote for and forming our political opinions. And so I think political parties should run larger field campaigns. It's in their interest, and it would serve democracy to have more in-person discussions that cross the aisle, so have discussions also with voters who disagree with them. The problem here is that it's harder and harder for parties to recruit activists to run such campaigns. So in the US, sometimes they pay people. In France, where there's less campaign money, you really need to rely on volunteers, and fewer and fewer people are willing to give time. I think a second actor is companies. Companies are now increasingly sensible to the weakening of democracy and are increasingly asking what they can do. And I think our instinct oftentimes is to say, please stay away. We don't want you. We don't want your money. We don't want you to meddle with democratic choice. But there are a few things that companies can do and that they actually have started doing, including in the US. One of them is to facilitate and encourage the electoral participation of their collaborators and of customers, like, for instance, giving time to vote on election day, reminding people where they have to vote, perhaps if you're Lyft or Uber, offering a free ride to the polling station on the election day. These things can make a difference. But closer to our topic, companies have started attempts at depolarizing their workforce. And if you think about it, where do we still sometimes meet people who disagree with us? Well, rarely among our family members, increasingly rarely among our neighbors, since, as I mentioned, there's increasing geographic partisan segregation. One of the places, rarely among our friends, one of the places in which that still happens is at the workplace. There you can interact with people that you respect because they are good professionals, but that might disagree with you. And so inevitably before an election, discussions will take place on the workplace. And so then the question is, what can employers do? What can CEOs, what can business leaders do? And so some groups offer now workshops in which employees can be trained to better understand the psychological roots of their own opinions, to discover possible cognitive biases that may affect how they reason, and to better understand the perspectives of other people, of other participants in the workshop. And finally, that they are being coached to look for common ground. And I think these initiatives are very promising because, again, the workplace is one of the few last places where we can regularly interact with people who have a different opinion than ours.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned companies, we talked about voters, about citizens that could get a vaccine against misinformation. And then you told me, well, these problems are so hard to solve, but for you, one thing we should do more is pressure politicians to reduce polarization. How can we do that concretely?
Yeah, so I think ultimately affective polarization, the fact that we are disliking, hating, distrusting people we disagree with more than ever in America and many other countries, that's the ultimate problem here, right? That's why we're so worried about social media and misinformation. And given that affective polarization is such a big problem, politicians should be talking about it. And I don't know that any leading, I know it's a bit academic, a bit jargony, but they don't talk about polarization much in general. So I think we should be pressuring our leaders at the very top, the president, the Senate majority leader, things like that, to acknowledge that polarization is this huge, maybe the biggest problem we face. And also that cognitive biases contribute to it. So they should be talking about cognitive biases. I don't think that's too much to expect of our politicians. And we should be calling them out when they do things that reflect biases. Just as we call them out when they sometimes politicians say things that are bigoted or sexist or problematic in various ways. We call them out for that. Let's call them out for being polarizing and for showing other cognitive biases. And so we have a lot of organizations that are sort of working on grassroots depolarization in the US. And I think that's great, working directly with citizens and students. But I think we should put some pressure on people at the top. Now, how do you do that? You ask the media to do it. You come up with organizations who lobby or talk to politicians as directly as possible, but they're not going to solve the problem on their own. They need to be forced to do it or forced to make some change. And I think we should be asking them to come up with real solutions for depolarizing, real policy changes too. A kind of far out idea I suggest in my book is third-party mediation of Democrats and Republicans in Congress. We know that when a husband and wife aren't getting along, we need a third-party mediator to help. It's just really hard to sort out, he said, she said arguments. So we need a neutral third party, and the media isn't working, isn't fulfilling that role in the U.S. now. So who else could be a good third party? I don't know. Another kind of far-out idea would be, given that social media we know that if you are biased, you're going to cause problems on social media. You're going to believe misinformation and spread it, and these things harm society. Maybe we should require, just as we require drivers to be licensed before going out on roads and harming other drivers, maybe we should require social media users to be trained and licensed before using the social media. I don't think that's a completely off the wall idea. Maybe it has no chance of being feasible, but more generally, I think we should pressure actual policymakers to think of interesting policies like this and come up with some real concrete changes, because we're just snowballing toward, more and more problems as it is. The risk of violence and other, seriously scary things is continuing to grow.
Okay. We are lucky. I'm sitting next to someone who is working closely with policymakers, so maybe he can enlighten us about this.
I have no answer about the license for social media.
Not this one, but how to pressure politicians. I'd like to finish with you, Michael Nathan, because once again you're here, the practitioner, and I would like to hear the solution that you have on your side, but it would be interesting also to have your reaction on what you've heard today on the different proposals that made our four or three other speakers.
Yep, thank you. I think what is interesting here is that we're sharing the same understanding or perception of what's happening out there. So if I use a metaphor, I would say that the space between the sender and the people that are sending the information and people that are receiving the information, this space is extremely viscous, extremely opaque. We don't know what's happening there, and we have absolutely no guarantee that when the information is going out, it will be effectively received. When it's finally received, sometimes, there is no guarantee either that it would be the right information. Sometimes that is changed, it has been modified, and it's not necessarily understood. So when you are talking about the public environment and talking about public policies, there is quite an obligation to ensure that this information is existing. So the way we have approached that, and believe me, we have tried many different things, and I'm not sure that we have found the right recipe, but at least we are trying to really transform and transform the way we were doing things. We were communicating about policies, and public policy specifically. The first thing is really to modernize the way we're doing it. I used that sentence earlier today. About expectation is the new currency. When everything around you is at a certain level of modernism, of quality, we cannot expect that when we're talking about public policies, we will be under that level. So we have to modernize, and transform the public communication. The other thing is that we have to ensure that people are understanding who the sender is. So that means that we have to ensure that there is a concrete reallocation to the state. And in France, because of the polarization that has been mentioned earlier, and because of the fragmentation that I mentioned, there is a confusion between the pure political decision, which is obviously associated to that fragmentation that I was talking about, and the implementation of the public policy that is linked to that political decision. There is quite a long strand between those two steps, so we have to ensure that those two are linked, and that people are understanding where does it coming from. So it's a question of modernizing the way we're doing it, and as well explaining where does it come from and what does it mean. So the way we are trying to transform this communication is really around those two areas, and more specifically to ensure that in this area of multiple information that are sent, and the fact that there is so many people that are talking about the same thing at the same moment, what we're trying is to rationalize the way we are talking about those things. So sequencing the way we are communicating, ensuring that those two areas are answering one to the other, is one of the key objectives that we are trying to achieve. And last, but I would say not least, obviously, there is quite an inversion of strengths and weaknesses in that area. If you think about let's say at the origin, I think the political communication was quite stronger than the institutional communication. Today, I would say that this is the inverse that has happening. There is a really strong power behind the institutional and corporate, I would say, communication, because there is something in addition. There is something something like official information that is coming from that area that we should capitalize on. So we are assuming, who we are. And that's one of the transformation and modernization aspect of what we're doing. And even we are linking those the two areas of the communication, political and institutional. And we are using new techniques in order to use the natural strength of the institutional side to reinforce the political side. So, and this is where let's say the behavioral science is helping us, because when we are able to really think about that, use the right way to position ourselves in terms of communication on the right path, thinking about the citizen, being citizen-centric when we are developing communication is really a game changer, I think, in terms of perception. At the end of the day, the objectives for us is not to change the politics. I mean, we are not here to do to develop a new license for social media or something like that. But we are strongly convinced that we have a role to play in the perception between the decision and the implementation of a public policy. This is the job that we are doing, and this is where transformation of communication has a role to play.
Thank you, Michael. Maybe one last word, because we have 30 seconds left. The behavioral sciences are easier to use for what you call institutional communication. It's complicated with politicians, right?
Yes, absolutely. So the idea is to use behavioral science on the way we are designing this communication. The example of the metaphor of the vaccine has been used earlier today, and I think what we have worked on during the COVID crisis, using behavioral insight in order to transform and to maximize the impact and the effect of the communication was quite useful. So what we have learned there was quite specific, obviously, and we hope that we will never see that again in terms of configuration. But the learnings and the insight that we have there is very useful, and we have to reuse it in the way we are building a communication plan for tomorrow.
Thank you, Michael. We have questions from the audience. I see the first one, but I'm not sure. Well, I will tell the question, and we'll see if one of you feel like a philosopher today and can answer the question, because it is in this quest for narrative heightened by is this quest for narrative heightened by the myth of religion in the Western world? I mean, do conspiracies fill a gap left by a lack of religion? I don't have the answer personally. Someone?
I mean, I'm happy to take a quick stab at that, because
okay,
the thing
Sander.
is, people always ask me if religion is the biggest conspiracy, and so you know, it's an interesting question. I think people have compared religious worldviews with conspiratorial worldviews, and you actually find that there's some overlap in how they're structured. So you know, when people who are extremely religious are challenged, they jump to higher levels of explanation, because it's a self-enclosing system, right? You can never get beyond the evidence, because it's based on some larger faith that is invisible. But it works the same with conspiratorial worldviews too. There's always a bigger conspiracy, somebody higher in charge, and it goes up and up and up. And so that's why you can never really argue with a conspiracy theorist, because even though there are different things, right, they have similar psychological mechanisms.
Thank you, Sander. Do we have other questions, maybe in the room or from people online? Okay.
Sander, could you explain, because I think it will be very concrete for our audience, your idea of the fake news game or other games that you have developed to inoculate this psychological vaccine?
Yeah, so the reasoning that we've taken is that we've developed some online games which are free and educational, as well as videos that are deployed on social media that allow people to sort of experiment with this idea of the vaccination analogy. So the way it works is that you actually step into the shoes of somebody who's trying to manipulate you online, and you familiarize yourself with weakened doses in a controlled environment of the tactics that are used, creating polarizing headlines, conspiracy theories, using negative emotions to scare people, and you use these in scenarios, and you craft your own news, and along the way, you start building this intuition for what people are doing to deceive others online. And so you sort of build resistance in a controlled social media environment. And that's really what the simulations are about. They give people a sense of, of what these attacks look like on actual social media and how they are created. And that's sort of the weakened dose metaphor. And then we test people before and after with misinformation that contains some of these techniques, and we find that people are relatively more immune to them. And the way that this would work in practice is, for example, on YouTube, we've created 30-second videos that inoculate people against extremist techniques. And these can be scaled in the ad spaces. You know those annoying ads on YouTube that you can't skip? So that's where the pre-bunk could go. And that can be scaled across billions of people all at once. And we don't use any actual controversial stuff as the weekend dose in those videos. So, for example, the weekend analogy here might be a clip from Star Wars, so Revenge of the Sith. So we show people the climatic scene between Anakin Skywalker, who goes on to become Darth Vader, and Obi-Wan, and Anakin sort of says, "You're either with me or you're my enemy." And then Obi-Wan says, "Only a Sith deals in absolutes." And the narrator kind of explains that this is a false dilemma. And politicians, they love to use false dilemmas. So they present people with only two options, while in fact there's many more. And that's one way to get people to lure people into more extremist modes of thinking and voting, because it seems that there's two opposing options, right, polarizing options, while in fact there's much more nuance. But you don't have to talk about abortion, immigration, or any of that to inoculate people against this technique. You can just show them how Darth Vader is doing it in Star Wars by making the good side choose between either you're my friend or you're my enemy. And when people receive that weekend dose and we test them on YouTube, we find that they actually become better at identifying this technique in real social media content. So that's the idea.
Eric, maybe you have other questions for one of our other speakers? Or
After the reaction from Michael, it's more for Vincent and for Dan. You have here someone who is very important in the French governmental communication. What would be your one piece of advice for him to reinforce democracy?
tricky question. Vincent or Dan? Who wants to go?
I guess I unmuted first. I'll be fast. Offhand, the immediate, that's a great question. One thought would be to do whatever you can to maintain trust across the political spectrum. So trust is crucial, and certain actions which might seem clearly to be objectively best are going to be perceived by parts of society as biased or political for various reasons. And if you can get ahead of that and somehow address that, I know it's a hard thing to do, but be mindful of the crucial importance of trust from all of your constituents, and try to manage it as you go.
Vincent, would you like to add something?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's something that Michael can directly implement, but I guess to the extent that he has the ear of other people in the administration and in the government. I had thought about democracy, and in particular one aspect, which is participation, because of course you don't have a democracy if you don't have voters, and the US is an outlier there because participation has been increasing since the 2000s. But if you look at most other Western democracies, including France, the participation is on the decline. And so it seems to me that there are immediate things that are directly actionable here. One is to decrease the number of election dates, so to put together multiple elections. For instance, there is no reason to have separate dates for regional elections, departmental elections, municipal elections. All these could take place on the same day. Presidential and parliamentary elections could take place on the same day. And if people have to vote less often, it also means that the cost of voting will be lower. You could imagine making voter registration automatic. It's a French specialty that we have to register to vote before voting. In most countries, the state takes care of registering people, and that's something that is easy to do. We have the information about who is a citizen and where they live. So that's a mystery to me that we still impose this cost. And then, of course, if you think long term, you have to indeed work on increasing trust, work on increasing the perceived benefits of voting, work on increasing the sense of citizenship. And here you have to target the young voters, I think. And one of the things that could be done is to rejuvenate the way in which we do civic education. We all remember civic education courses that were extremely boring when they were taking place and not replaced by history or geography classes. There are ways to teach civic education based on actual case studies. I have some colleagues at the business school that have written case studies about key moments in American democracy. And now these case studies are being taught in high schools in the US with success. So one could imagine doing the same in France.
Okay, thank you, Vincent. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have just 1 minute left, and I would like Michael maybe to react to those tips to save democracy and establish trust.
I'm not sure that I will be able to do that on my own, but I think maybe I can share some kind of learning of what happened for the last election. And the Service d'information du gouvernement is in charge of developing the communication action in order to promote and to ensure people are going to vote. The challenge with that kind of campaign is that we're not asking, we're not proposing to people to vote for someone, but to vote as an institutional action. So the way we are trying to do that for many years, and I think the results were not necessarily very good. And the reason that has been mentioned, the fact that we have those issues of being the necessity of registration before voting is a lot of things that are doing some kind of inhibition in the way we see people are going to vote effectively. The point that I want to mention here is that in order to ensure that those campaigns are working better, is that we work with third-party partners. We have worked with an NGO specifically on this topic, an NGO named Avote, that help us to touch the young audience. So the challenge was there. So we were not only on our side, the government, to ensure to ask people to go to vote. We were doing that with somebody else, and those guys bring us some of you talked about loss of confidence or lack of confidence or lack of trust. Those guys give us part of the trust they have in order to push people to go to vote. That was quite an interesting insight in terms of the way we should do this in the future. So not believing on that because we are the government, we're able to tackle any of that kind of issue, working with partners, with third-party partners. That could be an NGO, that could be institutional partners, that could be other people. I think the institutional communication can work going through third-party partners.
Thank you, Michael. And this will be the last word of the discussion. Thank you very much to the four of you. It was very interesting. And, well, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.